This morning, we're concluding this very long study out of 1 Corinthians, this letter. We've entitled it, A Letter to a Fractured Fellowship. We actually began this series on April 11th, and since I've been here, this is the longest Sunday morning series that we have done. And Pastor Lou and Pastor Brian have helped me with this, and we've been preaching through this great letter. Now, for some of you, you're saying that, man, this has been a long series. I mean, this is message number 30, and it goes all the way back to April. Well, I was looking up John MacArthur's series on 1 Corinthians, and it took him 2.5 years and 81 messages. So I think we could have went a little longer than what we did, but it is a great letter. And even with spending this much time in it, we certainly couldn't touch every facet of this great letter of the Apostle Paul. I chose this because I felt that, and still feel this way, and even more so after preaching through the letter, that is so relevant to the 21st century. That what was happening in the first century, though that we are separated by culture and geography and history from the Corinthians, yet at the same time, we've seen that many of these issues are very contemporary to our culture. Human nature does not change, and history has a way of repeating itself. So we've dealt with some pretty, tough areas in this letter. I know some people have become kind of wearied by it and thinking, wow, when are you going to get through 1 Corinthians? There's some real brutal stuff in here. Now, when we come to the last chapter, there's not any real doctrinal issue or particular thing that Paul is straightening out. But let's not be too quick to read over the closing chapter. And just because there's not a lot of what you might say exciting things in here, let's be reminded this is the Word of God, and all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable. When the Bible speaks, God speaks. And so He has something for us even in this last chapter. What Paul does is he gives some practical instructions here, but then he gives some personal insight into his ministry, which is really important, I think, as we see the heart of the Apostle Paul as he's been through this long letter. Can you imagine the Apostle Paul as under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit? And we don't believe in dictation, that God just said, write this, and he wrote it, mechanically. God used his personality and his experiences, but what was produced, that's what we mean by inspiration, God breathed, were the very words that God wanted him to write. So this would have not been an easy letter for Paul to sit down and to have this letter written. And so we believe that the Apostle Paul really bears his heart. He's done it through the letter, and he does it now in this concluding chapter. First thing we see is a special collection designated for a special purpose. A special collection designated for a special purpose. Verse 1, now concerning. Well, back in chapter 7, we noted that when Paul started chapter 7 with now concerning, he was answering questions that the Corinthians had put to him in a letter to him. And so this is another area where Paul, since chapter 7, is writing back to them about something they had a question about. Their question is about this collection for the saints. Paul here, we see, uses his apostolic authority. Paul was indeed an apostle. He said, I've given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. And then he gives the instruction. On the first day of the week, let each of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me. Now that seems kind of perfunctory, but this is kind of important here because Paul is giving instructions on collecting these gifts for the church of Jerusalem. Because the church of Jerusalem, the Christians there, many of them were Jews, were suffering greatly from persecution. And this was, in a sense, the mother church. There was no official hierarchy there, but this is the church where the gospel came from. And these churches that Paul started and other New Testament local churches, in a sense, owed a debt back to the believers at Jerusalem for sending out missionaries and sending the gospel out to these people, heard it, and they came to faith in Christ. So Paul has been going around to these churches and instructing them, we need to send a gift to the church in Jerusalem to help out our brothers and our sisters. Because Paul wanted to show them that their local church was not isolated. And sometimes we can kind of be that way. You know, if a church gets inwardly focused so much, they lose the vision of their vision. They lose their vision for ministry and for missions. At the members' meeting last Sunday night, Greg got up and read for us and talked about all the ministries that we at Grace Bible Church support on the foreign field and nationally and on the local field. Because Paul wants to turn their attention to the fact that there are other Christians out there. There are churches and believers beyond their borders, to realize that we're all part of the same team in a sense. We're all part of the church, and even though we're in local churches, and Paul wants to expand their vision beyond themselves. And so he's challenging this local congregation to send a gift to the people in Jerusalem. You see, free will offerings have always been God's means to support God's people and to support God's programs. And so this is what we see throughout the Bible. Even if you go back to the Old Testament and you see when Moses was collecting items for the tabernacle, it said anybody who has a willing heart. So it's giving from the heart. It's a willing heart. And even though Paul is giving instruction here, by what he says, notice that this is really a giving out of the grace of your heart. He says, on the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper. Giving should be systematic and proportionate to God's blessing in each believer's lives. Now, even though this instruction is given for a specific gift to be taken to Jerusalem, there are still principles that we often apply from this passage to regular giving in the local church. Our church is supported only by the gifts and offerings of God's people. Other churches have a different view. That's up to them. What we do is, everything we do at Grace is because of the free will offerings of God's people. And so Paul has given this instruction that giving should be systematic and proportionate to God's blessing in their life. You know, our giving is a statement of how much we believe God has blessed us. We don't believe in a tithe per se. That might be a good starting point, but it's not commanded in the New Testament. We believe in what's called grace giving. You give as you desire, and God has blessed you. And that's between you and the Lord. But it's really an evidence of how much I believe God has blessed my life. Now, this carries over from chapter 15, verse 58. Remember, the chapter and verse divisions are not inspired. The text is inspired. And so we ended up last week, therefore, my beloved brethren, in verse 58, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord, now concerning the collection for the saints. So giving is part of abounding in the work of the Lord, supporting the work of the Lord, as we'll see in this text. And Paul also models the importance of being good stewards with the funds that people give to the Lord's work. And so Paul said, I've designated people to take this to Jerusalem, and I might even come along with them. But it shows that Paul took his responsibility, and we take our responsibility very seriously, because whatever you give to our local church is not ours, it's the Lord's. And we will stand one day as leaders and give an accounting for how we have managed the funds that you have given to Christ through the church. Now, the next thing Paul does is he gives us insight into his ministry. You know, Paul is very personal as he's ending this letter, and Paul placed a real high value on personal, face-to-face ministry, face-to-face discipleship. Look at verse 5. Now, I will come to you when I pass through Macedonia, northern Greece, for I am passing through Macedonia, that it may be that I will remain or even spend the winter with you, that you may send me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not wish to see you now on the way, but I hope to stay a while with you if the Lord permits. But I tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost. So Paul is saying, look, I want to come, but I want to come when I can spend some time with you. And Paul realizes this letter has been pretty difficult, and Paul wants to come face to face and minister to these people. He loved these people. He founded this church. This was probably a smaller church, very likely a house church, meeting in someone's home. Paul would probably know most of the people there, except for those who had come after he had went on his journey. And so this is a very personal appeal from the Apostle Paul. But notice the phrase, if the Lord permits. If the Lord permits. Paul's life was always subject to the Lord's leading. And so Paul is having a very effective ministry in Ephesus. Paul wrote the 1 Corinthian letter from Ephesus. And so in verse 9 he says, a great and effective door has been opened to me, and there are many adversaries. The open door represents the opportunity to preach the gospel, and I believe, and I've seen in my life, and I've seen it Sally and ours lives, I've seen it in the church's life, God ministers, God leads through open and closed doors. Right now, Paul had a very open door in Ephesus, but you will notice there are many adversaries. Very often, open doors increase adversaries. Why? Because Satan doesn't like his territory being invaded. And Ephesus was like Corinth. There was all kinds of idolatry going on. And so ultimately, there was a riot in Ephesus because of Paul's preaching. But Ephesus, a major city in the Roman province of Asia, and the gospel went through that whole Roman province of Asia, coming out of the ministry of the Apostle Paul. You see that in Acts 19, verse 26. And so Satan is opposing. You know, you're going to get involved in ministry on any level. It takes commitment. And one of the reasons it takes commitment is because it will be challenging. True ministry on any level is challenging. Satan doesn't want his kingdom attacked. And so he is very serious about opposing the ministry of the Lord. Then he brings up Timothy. The church was to receive Timothy and to support him. Verse 10, if Timothy comes, see that he may be with you without fear. He does the work of the Lord, as I also do. Therefore, let no one despise him, but send him on his journey in peace, that he may come to me, for I am waiting for him with the brethren. So he says, when Timothy comes, I want you to care for him. I want you to accept him. And when it's time to go, I want you to support him financially so he can come back to me. Now, let's think about this a little bit. If you know anything about Timothy, we often talk about Timothy the timid. You know, when Paul writes 1st and 2nd Timothy, he points some things out. He tells Timothy, you know, you need to don't be fearful, you know. And then he talks about the fact that Timothy's health was not the best. And he told him to take a little wine for his stomach's sake and his oft infirmities. So he's sending Timothy, who also is young. He is kind of sickly. He seems to be naturally timid. And of all places, he's sending him to the church of Corinth. Now, when Paul was there, these Corinthians were not very kind to the Apostle Paul. In fact, they challenged Paul, and there was a little group in the church that were challenging the fact that Paul was even an apostle and had the right to come and say these things to these people. So why would Paul send Timothy to that church of all places? Well, the work is the Lord's work. We see that. He does the work of the Lord. And see, the Lord is the one who gives out the assignments. And Paul certainly must have believed it was God's will for him to send Timothy there. And he believed that Timothy could have an effective ministry. You see, all Christian ministry is ultimately Jesus Christ ministering through his people. Back in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, Paul writes, I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. Timothy didn't have to be the Apostle Paul to do the work of the Lord. And you don't have to be somebody else to do the work of the Lord. Your gifts are your gifts. Your talents are your talents. Your opportunities are your opportunities. And too often we're like the Christians at Corinth, and we've seen this throughout the letter. They were jealous of each other. They wanted the gift that the other person had. They were very divided, and there was a lot of contention in the congregation. And so Paul sends young Timothy there to help minister to these people. And in 1 Timothy 4:12, Paul says, let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. I really think he was preparing Timothy for the work that lay ahead of him, because we sort of look at Timothy as Paul's protege. They're the other people that Paul ministered with. And I think after Paul was martyred, Timothy probably took up the mantle. And we'll find more about Timothy when we see him in eternity, to find out just what did he do after Paul was martyred. I think he was teaching Timothy something else. There's no ideal place of ministry. There is no ideal place of ministry. Some people are going around looking for the ideal church. Well, you're going to be going around and around and around. There's no ideal church. There's no ideal pastors. There's no ideal ministry. Nobody's perfect. We're all broken people. We're all sinners saved by grace. We're all being matured and sanctified by the Holy Spirit and the Word of God. And if you're looking for perfection, you're not going to find it. So I think Paul would have said something like this to Timothy: accept your limitations and assume your responsibilities. And I would say that to you. Accept your limitations, assume your responsibilities. You don't have to be somebody else. God uniquely created you for the ministry that you have, and he will place you, if you're willing, in a local church where he can use you and your spiritual gifts. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So if no one can do everything and everyone can do something, what is the something God wants you to do? And are you doing it? And then Paul modeled something else. He modeled the importance of teamwork in ministry. This is really insightful into the heart of the Apostle Paul. Verse 12, now concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to come to you with the brethren, but he was quite unwilling to come at this time. However, he will come when he has a convenient time. Now, we know from chapter 3, there was an Apollos clique in the church. There were people saying, I'm of the Apollos party, and I'm of the Paul party, and I'm of the Peter party, Cephas. And we saw how Paul dealt with that back in chapter 3. So Paul knew that there was an element in the church that really loved Apollos and probably loved his teaching and preaching. We find out from the book of Acts, Acts chapter 18, verse 24, he is a Jew from the very sophisticated city of Alexandria, and he was an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures. So he was very intellectual, probably very educated, and he has a real grasp of the Bible. Now, if you remember the story of Apollos, particularly the Old Testament, and he really didn't understand since Christ had come, and then this precious couple, if you remember, Aquila and Priscilla took him aside and showed him the way of God more perfectly. So he comes to Corinth with letters from Ephesus to commend him to this congregation. And when he gets there, Acts 18:28, he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. I mean, I'll bet the Jews just hated him in Corinth because he had such a grasp of the Old Testament. He was such an intellectual individual and a godly man, and he would refute with these Jews, and he would show them from their own scriptures that Jesus is indeed the Christ, their Messiah. And so Paul comes along and he says, I've been urging Apollos to come back to Corinth. Okay? So Paul knows how much a certain segment of the congregation really appreciates his ministry. But Paul saw Apollos not as a competitor, but as a ministry partner. You see Paul's unselfishness here. You see Paul had a true servant's heart. You see Paul believed in teamwork. And he knew that Apollos could reach certain people that he could not reach. Chapter 3, verse 5, we read, who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one. You find no self-promotion from Paul. And Paul didn't try to play the Holy Spirit in Apollos' life. You know, sometimes we think we know better than the Holy Spirit. Paul said, Apollos, I really think you should go. And Apollos says, no, I'm not going to go right now. As the Lord wills, He, like Paul, was subject to the will of God for his life. And Paul and Apollos and Timothy understood the ministry was the Lord's work. It wasn't their ministry, it was the Lord's ministry. Jesus made a really important comment on this idea of servantship in Luke chapter 17, verse 10. When you've done all those things which are commanded, saying, we are unprofitable servants, we have done what was our duty to do. The word unprofitable means unworthy, without need. There's no need for fanfare when we're doing our duty. The idea here is that it means no one owes the servant anything. But we know the Lord is going to reward service one day when we stand at the judgment seat of Christ, if you know Christ is your Savior. I've told you this before, but it's so important. You can tell how much of a servant you are when somebody treats you like one. Oh, I have a servant's heart. Really? Well, how do we respond? How do I respond when somebody treats me like a servant? That'll show me whether I have a servant's heart or not. And then Paul's concluding exhortations. That doesn't mean it's the end of the message. Don't get excited. It's Paul's concluding exhortations. Look at verse 13. Watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong. Now, he's reemphasizing what he just wrote back in chapter 11, verse 58, kind of similar admonitions here. Chuck Swindoll says, Paul warns us not to be part of the ignorant masses. I really like that. Don't be part of the ignorant masses. Do you know what's going on in our culture? Do you understand? Do you interpret things according to the Word of God? Do you understand that, God has a plan that he's working out in the world today? The word watch here means to awake. That's what it means. Wake up. I think it's very easy for us as believers to sort of be lulled into a comfortable complacency. I mean, we live in the greatest country in the world. We have the greatest luxuries. There are people around the world who can only dream of the things we take for granted. They can't even fathom the kind of material blessings and health blessings that we have to live in this great nation. And if we're not careful, we can become very complacent. And then he says, stand fast in the faith. In other words, be firm in what you believe, because there are multiple doctrines of demons, 1 Timothy 4:1, that are out there. You see, don't think that just false teaching is just false teaching. It all comes from the same mind, the mind of Satan. Doctrines of demons, Paul calls them. Certainly interesting. You can take all the religions of the world and put them on one side, and you can take biblical New Testament Christianity and put it on this side. It stands all alone, completely alone. Because in this whole bunch over here, basically what you have is you have to do something in order to be saved. You have to contribute to your salvation. The Bible never teaches that. Only New Testament biblical Christianity teaches salvation by grace through faith. Grace is unmerited favor. We don't do it. There's no hoops to jump through. Have you understood that? Maybe you were raised in a church where you were taught you had to do certain things to make sure you're saved and to stay saved. Where the Bible teaches, for by grace we're saved. We have standing in Christ when we trust him as Lord and Savior. And then he says, be brave. Be brave. I think the King James has something like, quit you like men or act like men. It's the idea to conduct oneself in a manly or courageous way. You could say be courageous. I think what he's saying is stop whining. Stop complaining. Stop acting like little spoiled children. Grow up, And sometimes we need that kind of an admonition, don't we? Paul then says, be strong. He's not talking about the Greek concept of physical beauty and athletic prowess that was so dominant in Greek-Roman culture. He's not talking about physical strength. He's talking about spiritual strength. Ephesians 3:16, be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man. A spiritual strength that comes from the filling of the Holy Spirit. And then Paul sums up Christian living and ministry with one word. One word. Verse 14. Let all that you do be done with love. love. This is that agape love we learned about back in chapter 13. This is the love generated in the heart of the believer by the Holy Spirit. The world can't love with this kind of love. This is spiritual love. This is divine love. Oh, the world can love, but not with this level or depth of love. This is self-sacrificial love, selfless love, the love that Jesus Christ has for us. So important that Paul devoted that whole section back in chapter 13, verses 1 through 13, to explain this love. And you can take chapter 13 and you can sum it up with basically Paul said, everything minus love equals nothing. Everything minus love equals nothing. This congregation at Corinth was tragically lacking in this kind of love for one another. And this is the love that Jesus said would define us as a disciple. John 13, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, meaning you love with this kind of love, the love that I modeled for you, by this all will know that you are my disciples if you have love. If you have this kind of selfless, sacrificial, spirit-generated love for one another, and I sense that love in our congregation. I am so thankful for that. This is a very loving congregation. But we cannot rest on our laurels. We cannot assume that with the way we are now is the way we're always going to be. We are all responsible to continue to foster that kind of love. If we were to follow these commandments that Paul is giving, being courageous, stand by the faith, but we don't have love, then we would be one of those harsh, intolerant, I'm not talking about tolerating sin, but I mean we'd be one of those harsh, intolerant Christians or congregations. You got to use the Bible we use. You got to sing the songs we sing. You got to dress the way we say you should dress. Not that we don't have doctrine and beliefs in church polity, but I'm talking about those primarily non-essential things. And then Paul urges submission to the spiritual servants. Verse 15, I urge you, brethren, you know the household of Stephanas, that is the first fruits of Achaia, that they have devoted themselves to the ministry of the saints, that you also submit to such, and to everyone who works and labors with us. Now this is interesting. This is a family. Stephanas, the household of Stephanas. So probably a wife and children. Households back then could also maybe include extended family members. Very likely it could, and many times for more wealthy families, include servants. So if you remember the story, when Paul came to Corinth, he went to the synagogue, debated with the rulers of the synagogue, and they blasphemed. And so Paul took his robe and shook it and said, from now on I go to the Gentiles. And he went to the next door, to the house of a guy named Crispus, and he starts preaching right next door to the synagogue. And even the ruler of the synagogue must have made his way over, and he got saved, which must have really ticked the Jews off in the synagogue. And somewhere this man, Stephanas, came to know the Lord as his Savior, because he heard the preaching of the gospel, the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ is God, and he died on the cross for our sins, lived the perfect life we could not live, died on the cross and paid the debt to God we cannot pay. And when you believe that and humble yourself and admit you're a sinner and ask Christ to come into your heart and save you from your sin and commit your life to follow Jesus, this man and his household responded to the message of the gospel. In verse 17, I am glad about the coming of Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Acacius. I do the best I can. And what was lacking on your part, they supplied. For they refreshed my spirit in yours. Therefore, acknowledge such men. These men may have been elders in the church. We don't know for sure. They were some kind of spiritual leaders. And Paul is telling this very fractious congregation, you need to respect your spiritual leaders. 1 Thessalonians 5, we urge you, brethren, recognize those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord, admonish you, esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake. Be at peace among yourselves. Meaning, you esteem them not because they're such great guys, but because they do the work of the Lord. Now, sometimes we look at the Apostle Paul like he's Superman, Like nothing would ever bother him. Like Paul was such a strong personality and such a super apostle that he didn't really need encouragement, that Paul would just, and sometimes he did, he had to go it alone. But we get some real insight into the heart of Paul. Because these men from Corinth, they came to Ephesus where Paul had many open doors, but there were a lot of challenges, a lot of opposition. And notice what he says, for they refreshed my spirit. Paul took things to heart. When he writes the second letter to the Corinthians in chapter 11, verse 28, he will speak of my deep concern for all the churches. Paul carried that burden on his heart for many of these churches that he had planted and others he knew of. And so Paul took things very personally. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8, Paul gives some more personal insight. We do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Paul said, we went through some trials that, we really, really struggled. We were despairing. And so these men came and greatly encouraged and exhorted the Apostle Paul. And I love it that it says, they refreshed my spirit. And we often think of Paul being the one who would refresh the spirits of other believers. And yet, Paul showed that this one another ministry goes all different ways in the local body of Christ. And then Paul's final comments, verse 19. The churches of Asia greet you. That's the Roman province of Asia. Aquila and Priscilla greet you heartily in the Lord, with the church that is in their house. And all the brethren greet you. Greet one another with a holy kiss. Now, Paul again reminds the congregation of Corinth, they're part of a larger body of believers. You guys aren't isolated. You're so ingrown, you think you're like it. And I remind you, all these churches of Asia greet you. And then he mentions this precious couple, Aquila and Priscilla. They're now in Ephesus ministering with Paul. Paul tells us that the church at Ephesus, or at least part of the church, is in their house, because they had house churches back then. What a precious couple. It is possible the church of Corinth met in their house, though we can't say that with certainty. But what we do know is later on they go back to Rome. If you recall, they were thrown out of Rome by the emperor when he had all the Jews taken out of Rome, and they were Jewish believers. So now they go back home to Rome, and then Paul writes to the Romans, Romans 16, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their own necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Likewise, greet the church that's in their house. So they're back in Rome, the hotbed of persecution, and they again have a church in their house. And they were literally risking their lives for the gospel and to aid the Apostle Paul. These are some of the heroes of the faith. And there are millions of unnamed heroes of the faith in every generation. And we're going to meet them one day in heaven. Paul uses the word greet 4 times in these 2 verses. Greet one another with a holy kiss. So I'm going to have you all stand up, and we're going to have a holy kiss greeting, and we're just going to go around and kiss each. No, we're not going to do that. In that culture, even now in Middle Eastern culture, people, even men, would kiss each other on the cheek. It was a very acceptable thing in culture, a practice. And I think, we interpret this in our culture as to what is an acceptable, tangible sign of acceptance. I think a good rule of thumb is men, treat older women as you would treat your mother, treat younger women as you would treat your sister, and I think vice versa for the ladies as well. But Paul does something which is really cool. He models the importance of personal touch. If you were reading the letter from the church, and can you imagine being in the church and listening to this letter? You're part of the congregation of Corinth, and you're in a house church, and you're gathered together, and everybody knows everybody, and the person who stands up in the congregation, he starts to read the letter from the Apostle Paul, and then we've seen there's some tough stuff in here. Probably at times you could hear a pin drop and people were getting uneasy. But the person who was reading it, when they're going along and they're reading it, when they finally came down to verse 21, in the original writing, it would suddenly change. Because Paul says, the salutation with my own hand, Paul's. We often believe that Paul had a secretary that he dictated it to. And now, at the end, Paul takes the pen, whatever, and it's like he signs his name. You know, this is from me. This is my signature on here. This is from the Apostle Paul. Very personal. But he ends the letter with a negative and with a positive. He calls down the curse of God's judgment upon those who would despise Jesus Christ. It's a pretty powerful statement when he says, if anyone does not love the Lord Jesus Christ, let him be accursed. Accursed. Anathema. It's a way of saying, let them be damned. Pretty strong language. And we dare not use it lightly. But Paul, apparently there were some in the church that maybe weren't even followers of Christ or causing problems. But then, after he shows the danger of rejecting Jesus or defaming his name, and by the way, in our culture, Jesus' name is defamed all the time. Be careful. Be very careful. Don't lightly use the name of Jesus. Paul is calling down a curse upon these people. But then he follows it up with the Aramaic phrase, Maranatha. Maranatha. In essence, O Lord, come. The coming of Jesus for us is a time of reward, a time of blessing. And then he says, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. My love be with you all in Christ Jesus. Amen. After he reads them the riot act throughout this letter, very strong letter, and Paul doesn't back down for anything, and then in the end he commends them to grace and commends to them love, and actually expresses his love for these Christians. This isn't like the rock star who stands up with 50,000 people and says, I love you. This is a church that Paul knew very well. Probably most of the church he knew by name. He could remember their faces as he writes this letter. And he tells them how much he loves them, even in their current condition. Paul loved them in spite of their faults. One of the great verses about the love that Paul had, agape love, is 2 Corinthians 12:15 in his second letter. He says, I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved. Wow, that's real, true agape love. Paul says, not how you treat me or how you respond to me, but I will love you no matter what. Because Paul loved them in spite of their flaws, in spite of their faults. And that's the kind of love that is modeled to the world that tells people we're different and we are Christians. We don't excuse sin, we don't accept sin, but we do accept sinners. And God accepts sinners and forgives them if they will come to him in faith, believing.